It was the kind of rain that turned streets into rivers and hearts into puddles. Margaret stood under the flickering neon lights of the Shell station, her coat soaked through, hair clinging to her cheeks like spiderwebs. Her husband's car, once familiar, now foreign, disappeared into the gray mist without so much as a glance back. No words. No explanations. Just a slammed door and spinning tires. She stood frozen, a paper coffee cup in one hand, her purse in the other. Her phone buzzed once in her coat pocket, low battery. She didn't check it. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was how ordinary it all felt. A Tuesday afternoon. A quick stop for gas. She thought he was just going inside to grab a drink. Instead, he'd left her there. In the middle of the city. In the middle of her life. The cashier inside offered a tissue and a confused, pitying glance. Margaret smiled politely, mouthed, "I'm fine," and stepped back out into the rain. But she wasn't fine. Not even close. She waited on the curb for hours, watching headlights blur into streaks. No texts. No calls. Just silence. Just wet shoes, and the heavy realization that she had no idea what came next. At 48, Margaret had believed her life was settled. Married 26 years. 2 grown kids in college. A townhouse with creaky stairs and too many picture frames. She had given up a career in publishing to raise her family, kept the home warm and clean, hosted holiday dinners, and said, "I'm fine," more times than she could count. But that day, left like trash beside a gas pump, something in her cracked. Not in the screaming, vengeful way the movies always showed. No. It was quieter than that. Like a vase falling in another room. A shatter you didn't hear until you saw the pieces. A friend finally picked her up around 7 p.m. By then, the rain had soaked through her bones. She sat in the passenger seat, silent, staring out the window, and whispered. "He's gone." The words felt foreign on her tongue. That night, she crawled into the cold side of the bed and waited for it all to be a mistake. But it wasn't. The next morning, she found a message in her inbox. Just a few lines. From him. "I'm sorry, Margaret. I can't do this anymore. I need something different. Please don't make this harder." Different. As if she were a pair of shoes he no longer liked. And so, the unraveling began. Not loud. Not fast. But piece by piece, like a loose thread she couldn't stop pulling. In the weeks that followed, there were meetings with lawyers, awkward silences with friends, whispers behind her back at the grocery store. Her children, blindsided, tried to stay neutral, but she could feel the distance growing. As if they were all waiting to see how she'd hold up under the pressure. If she'd shatter. She didn't. But she didn't shine either. Not yet. The divorce was finalized in early spring. There were no dramatic courtroom scenes, no last-minute confessions or reconciliations. Just paperwork. Cold signatures. A checkmark beside irreconcilable differences. 26 years condensed into legalese and silence. He took the SUV. She kept the townhouse. But even that was temporary. Because not long after the ink dried, her children, Jason and Emily, sat her down with worried looks and cautious words. "Mom," Jason began, voice tight. "We just think it's smart to talk about selling the house." Margaret blinked. "Selling?" Emily leaned forward. "It's too much for you now. The taxes, the maintenance. And Dad says he's entitled to half the equity anyway." Her heart thudded, a slow ache. "Dad says." She wanted to scream. To remind them of every scraped knee she'd kissed, every college form she'd filled, every meal she'd made while their father stayed late at the office. But she didn't. Instead, she nodded slowly and excused herself to the kitchen. She stared at the backsplash she'd tiled with her own hands 10 years ago and felt like a guest in her own life. Later that night, she ran her fingers along the walls as if saying goodbye. Her children weren't cruel. Just practical. But practicality felt like a betrayal when you were barely holding on. 2 months later, the house was listed. The real estate agent smiled too much and told her how charming everything was. Margaret smiled back, feeling like a museum exhibit of a life no one wanted to maintain. When the for sale sign went up, she didn't cry. She waited until midnight. Then she lay on the empty living room floor, surrounded by half-packed boxes, and whispered, "I don't know where to go." Her new apartment was small. A second-floor unit in a dated building with creaky floors and a view of the laundromat. The windows rattled when it rained. The oven leaned left. But it was hers. She moved in with only what she could carry and what she couldn't bear to leave behind. She kept a ceramic mug from her first anniversary. Her old college notebooks. 3 framed photos, one of her children as toddlers, one of her mother in a field of wildflowers, and one of herself on a forgotten beach, smiling like she meant it. The rest she let go of. Some to charity. Some to strangers. Some to memory. The loneliness came in waves. Not just the absence of a husband, but the quiet in between. No one waiting for her to cook. No late-night calls from the kids. No familiar rhythm of "Mom" echoing through the hallways. At first, she filled the silence with TV. Then wine. Then sleep. But eventually, she couldn't ignore the itch in her hands, the old ache that had once made her fill journals with stories and poems and unsent letters. She pulled out her college notebook one evening, sat by the window with a cup of tea, and flipped through pages yellowed by time. And for the first time in years, she wrote. She wrote about grief. About rain. About a woman at a gas station who became a ghost in her own life and had to learn how to exist again. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even good. But it was honest. And sometimes, honesty is where healing begins. Mornings were the hardest. The apartment didn't have blackout curtains like the old house, so the sun came in sharp and early. Margaret would lie there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for a reason to move. At first, there wasn't one. No work to rush to, she had left her part-time admin job during the divorce. No children to feed, they were both grown, wrapped up in lives she only saw on social media. No husband to cook for. Not even a dog to walk. Just her. And the silence. Until one morning, she walked past the hallway mirror on the way to the kitchen and stopped. The woman staring back at her didn't look broken. She looked tired, yes. Older. But not gone. Margaret leaned in closer. Her hair, once dyed out of obligation, was growing out silver at the roots. Her cheeks, rounder than she remembered, held traces of the young woman who once used to sing along to Joni Mitchell with the windows rolled down. She hadn't looked at herself like that in a long time. Not just looked, but seen. Something shifted. She poured coffee, grabbed the journal from her nightstand, and wrote 3 words at the top of a fresh page. Who am I? She didn't have an answer. But that morning, the question felt like a doorway. Margaret started taking long walks through the neighborhood. At first, just to pass the time. But soon she noticed the small things again, the smell of lilacs blooming through chain-link fences, the way the sky turned lavender at sunset. Things she used to notice before life got so busy. She brought her journal with her. Stopped on park benches. Scribbled thoughts. One entry read, "I'm not sure if I'm falling apart or finally waking up." Another said, "Maybe grief is just love with nowhere to go." She didn't show them to anyone. Not yet. But they were hers. And that was enough. One afternoon, she passed a community bulletin board outside the library. Taped to the corner, almost obscured by a lost cat flyer, was a small white sheet. Creative Writing Circle, Thursdays at 6 p.m. Beginners welcome. No judgment, just words. She almost laughed. It felt too poetic, like something out of one of the short stories she used to write in college. But that night, she found herself back at the board, staring at the same flyer. The next Thursday, she showed up. The library's basement smelled like old books and lemon-scented cleaning spray. Folding chairs in a circle. A pot of lukewarm coffee on a side table. There were 6 people already there, 2 gray-haired men, a woman in a wheelchair, a shy teenager, and a sharp-eyed woman named Ruth who looked like she took no nonsense and gave all the kindness in the world. "Welcome," Ruth said. "Have a seat. No pressure to read today. Just listen." Margaret sat. Listened. Took notes in the margins of her notebook. Everyone's words felt fragile and fierce and real. Like confessions dressed up as fiction. When she left that night, her hands were shaking. But her heart? It was warm. Back home, she stood in front of the mirror again. This time, she whispered to her reflection. "You're still here." And for the first time in a long time, she believed it. The writing circle became her ritual. Every Thursday at 6 p.m., Margaret would take the bus downtown with her notebook tucked under one arm and a thermos of coffee in her purse. The group never grew much, but it didn't need to. They were a strange, lovely patchwork of misfits with pens. Margaret still didn't read aloud. Not yet. But she listened. Closely. And every week, the walls she'd built inside her mind thinned just a little more. Ruth, the group's unofficial leader, always closed the sessions with the same words. "We write because the truth matters. Even if no one reads it but us." It struck Margaret deep, every time. At home, she began writing more intentionally. She moved beyond journaling. She started writing short scenes, dialogue, snippets of emotion wrapped in fictional characters. A woman who hid wine bottles in laundry baskets. A teenager who stole back her voice from an abusive stepfather. A widow who took up boxing at 65. They weren't autobiographical. But they were, in a way, deeply hers. She filled pages. Then whole notebooks. One night after group, as they were packing up, Ruth paused and said, "You ever think about taking a class?" Margaret hesitated. "A class?" Ruth nodded. "Creative nonfiction. Memoir. You've got something there, Margaret. You should dig." The idea lodged itself in her chest like a key turning in a rusted lock. She went home, opened her laptop, and typed. "Adult writing classes near me." Most of them were too expensive. Fancy universities, online platforms with big promises and even bigger price tags. But one listing stood out. Community college, night class, intro to memoir writing. $150 for 8 weeks. It felt almost manageable. Margaret stared at the screen. Her hand hovered over the mouse. She clicked register. When she got the confirmation email, she printed it, stuck it to her fridge with a cracked magnet, and stared at it for a long while. It wasn't just a class. It was a promise. The first night of class, Margaret wore her nicest sweater and still felt like a fraud. The room was small. 10 students, most of them younger. The instructor, a woman named Beth, had bright red glasses and a voice like chamomile tea. "Memoir," Beth said, "is not your autobiography. It's not a resume. It's the truth, in your voice, about the moments that changed you." Margaret's pen trembled as she took notes. The first assignment was terrifying. Write about a moment that broke you. She almost didn't do it. But that Sunday, after 3 cups of coffee and a long walk in the rain, she sat down and wrote a piece titled, "The Day He Left Me at the Gas Station." It poured out of her, gritty, raw, full of clipped sentences and thundercloud memories. She cried as she wrote it. Not the soft kind of crying. The ugly kind. The healing kind. The next class, she brought the pages but couldn't bring herself to read aloud. Beth asked for volunteers. A silence stretched. And then Margaret raised her hand. Her voice shook through the first paragraph. Her throat tightened when she read the line about standing in the rain, clutching her dead phone, watching his taillights vanish. But no one laughed. No one looked away. When she finished, the room was still. And then Beth whispered. "That was brave. That was real." Margaret blinked. Her hands were damp with sweat. But her heart beat steadier than it had in weeks. She wasn't just writing anymore. She was telling. And that made all the difference. That night, she walked home beneath a sky full of stars and thought, maybe I'm not done becoming. It was a gray morning in late October when Margaret hit send. Her manuscript, a loosely threaded collection of short memoirs, essays, and inner monologues, had taken her nearly 5 months to write. She called it Notes from the Edge of 49. It wasn't perfect. She knew that. But it was honest. Sharp in places, soft in others. Full of things she had once been too afraid to say out loud. Ruth had read 3 of the stories and said, simply, "You're not just writing anymore. You're bleeding truth onto paper. Someone needs to read this." So Margaret gathered every ounce of courage she had and submitted it to 3 small presses that accepted unagented manuscripts. She didn't expect anything. But deep down, she hoped. 2 weeks later, the first rejection came. It was polite. Painless, almost clinical. "Thank you for your submission. Unfortunately, it does not meet our current editorial needs." She read it 3 times. Then deleted it. The second rejection arrived a week later, with a subject line that read simply. Response to submission. "Your work is emotionally evocative, but we don't believe it is commercially viable. We wish you all the best." That one stung. Commercially viable. Like she was pitching a new cereal, not her soul. Margaret closed her laptop and sat very still. 4 hours. The third rejection was the worst. It came with no feedback, no signature. Just an auto-generated line. Declined. Submission status, closed. It felt like someone slamming a door without even opening it. For the next 10 days, she didn't write a single word. The apartment felt smaller. The silence louder. She worked extra shifts at the cafe to avoid herself. Came home exhausted, fell asleep in her clothes, and woke with her heart pounding. Every doubt came rushing back. Who did you think you were? You're not a real writer. This was a phase. A fantasy. Get over it. She missed 1 writing circle. Then 2. She didn't return Ruth's texts. Until the night she came home and found something slipped under her door. It was a plain white envelope. Inside, a single sheet of paper. In Ruth's typewritten font, 1 sentence stood out in the center. "Failure is not the opposite of success. It's the rehearsal." Below it, handwritten in Ruth's familiar, crooked scrawl. "Come back. Not because your writing was perfect. But because it was yours. That's what matters." Margaret stood there, holding the note, and something inside her chest cracked. But not in a painful way. It was a softening. A shift. She didn't cry. Not yet. She just sat down in the kitchen, made a cup of tea, and read the note again. And again. The next morning, she pulled out her manuscript. She didn't edit. She read it. Cover to cover. And yes, it was messy. It rambled in places. Some transitions were clunky. But the bones were strong. The voice, unmistakably hers. She picked up a pen. Flipped to a blank page. And began again. This time, not for publishers. Not for approval. But for the woman who had stood in the rain at that gas station. For the mother who'd packed up her whole life into 2 garbage bags. For the woman who dared to start over at 50. For herself. Because Margaret finally understood what no rejection could ever take from her. A writer isn't someone who gets accepted. A writer is someone who keeps writing. It started quietly. One evening, curled up in her thrift store armchair with a cup of chamomile tea, Margaret stared at the blinking cursor on her laptop screen. The glow lit her face in the dim apartment, and a strange thought passed through her mind. What if I just shared something? Not for money. Not for prestige. Not even for validation. Just to be heard. She remembered Ruth's advice months ago during one of their cafe talks. You don't have to wait for someone to give you permission. Just write. Publish it yourself if you have to. It's not about fame, it's about connection. That word stuck. Connection. She hadn't realized how hungry she was for it until then. So that night, she created a blog. Free, simple. No flashy design. No about me page. Just a title. The second half. And below that, a quiet tagline. Stories for those starting over. She uploaded a story she'd written in one sitting the week before. It was raw, vulnerable, about a woman who'd spent years disappearing into everyone else's needs, only to wake up one day and realize she didn't even remember the sound of her own voice. She didn't overthink it. Didn't edit much. She just hit publish. And then she closed the laptop and went to bed, not expecting a thing. The next morning, while stirring sugar into her coffee at the cafe before her shift, Margaret opened her email. And froze. 14 views. 6 likes. 3 comments. From strangers. Her heart raced. She clicked on the first comment. This made me cry in the best way. Thank you. Then another. I feel seen. I thought I was the only one. And one more. Please don't stop writing. Your voice is exactly what I needed this morning. Margaret sat very still. Then, slowly, she smiled. Not wide. Not beaming. But deep. The kind of smile that starts in the ribs and climbs its way up. That week, she wrote more. Not stories that screamed. Stories that whispered. Of quiet strength. Silent grief. Small victories. She wrote about the first time she let herself sleep in without guilt. About the morning she danced in the kitchen in socks while the toast burned. About buying herself flowers, not because it was a holiday, but because Tuesday deserved beauty too. And people responded. The blog didn't go viral. It didn't explode overnight. But it mattered. Because each story became a bridge between her and someone else. And on the other side of those bridges were women like her, tired, brave, aching to be more than the roles they'd been shoved into. 3 months in, Margaret had 600 subscribers. By 6 months, that number had grown to over 2,000. She received emails from all over the world. A retired librarian in Portland who said she hadn't written poetry since her divorce, until now. A grandmother in Toronto who printed out Margaret's stories and read them in the park every Sunday. A 26-year-old single mom in Atlanta who wrote, "You make starting over sound possible. Like maybe I haven't ruined everything." Each message was like a small light. Together, they lit up her life in ways she hadn't imagined possible. And one morning, while folding laundry and sipping coffee, Margaret received a message that changed everything. Hi Margaret. My name is Ingrid. I work with Willow Press, a small publishing house that amplifies women's voices, especially those over 40. One of our editors forwarded me your blog post, the day I forgot how to be small. It stopped me in my tracks. Have you ever considered turning your stories into a book? Margaret's hands trembled. For a second, she laughed, like it was some kind of prank. But it wasn't. It was real. That night, she called Ruth, who answered with her usual no-nonsense voice. Margaret, listen to me, Ruth said after hearing the news. Don't you dare say you're not ready. You've been ready. They're just finally catching up. The first time Margaret held her book in her hands, she cried. Not because it was perfect, it wasn't. The cover was simple, the paper a little thinner than she'd imagined. But it was real. It existed. A thing born from her grief, her healing, her truth. A book. Her book. The second half, notes on starting over. The publisher, Willow Press, didn't make grand promises. No national tour. No bestseller campaign. But they believed in her voice, and that was more than she ever thought she'd have. They assigned her a kind, meticulous editor named Lisa, who worked with her over Zoom calls in the evenings after Margaret's cafe shifts. They selected blog entries, polished transitions, and added new essays that filled in the gaps, the story behind the stories. Writing the book was not easy. There were chapters that reopened old wounds, like the one about the gas station in the rain. She nearly deleted it 3 times. But Lisa insisted. That chapter isn't about pain, she said gently. It's about survival. So Margaret kept it. And when she finally wrote the last line, maybe the second half isn't about returning to who we were. Maybe it's about becoming who we were meant to be all along. She exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for years. The book launched quietly. An email newsletter. A few Instagram posts. A podcast hosted by a middle-aged yoga teacher in Vermont who said Margaret's story reminded her of her sister's. There were no flashing billboards. No interviews on morning shows. But the book found its way into the right hands. A women's book club in Minneapolis picked it for their February read. A therapist in New Jersey kept copies in her waiting room. One librarian in Seattle emailed to say she ordered extra because the first 2 were always checked out. It didn't explode. But it spread. And with each message that landed in her inbox, every woman who said, "Your words felt like mine," Margaret felt something inside her finally settle. She moved into a slightly larger apartment, still modest, but with light that poured in through the windows in the morning like warm honey. The first thing she unpacked was her art supplies. She hadn't painted in years. But now, her fingers itched for it. Color. Movement. Emotion without words. She hung her work on the walls. They weren't masterpieces, but they were hers. At the community center a few blocks from her new place, she started teaching a weekly art class called Brush and Begin Again. The first session had 4 students. All women. All over 45. Each one whispered a version of the same thing. I haven't done this since I was a girl. Margaret just smiled. Then we start there. Her blog continued to grow, too. With each story she published, Margaret peeled back another layer, not just of her past, but of the present woman she was becoming. She wrote about learning how to flirt again. About how scary it was to sleep without checking her phone. About grocery shopping alone and realizing that peace didn't always come in loud celebrations. Sometimes, it arrived in silence and aisle 3. And always, her inbox overflowed with messages from women across cities, countries, continents. Your story is helping me write mine. I read your words aloud to my reflection. I thought I was too old. You reminded me I'm just beginning. One afternoon, while eating an overpriced pastry and editing a blog post, Margaret's phone rang. It was her daughter. The same daughter who once stood in her kitchen demanding the house be sold. But her voice was different now. Hey, Mom, she said. Guess where I am? Margaret smiled. No idea. A rally. Women's rights. I'm holding a sign. She paused. Then added, quietly. It says, my mom taught me how to start over. Margaret's heart swelled. Her throat tightened. And when her daughter said, I love you, she believed it. Fully. Finally. Later that week, her son called too. No requests. No demands. Just, how are you, Mom? And he waited. Not for a polite answer. For the real one. So she gave it. I'm good. Not just okay. Not just getting by. Good. In her journal that night, Margaret wrote. I lost everything I thought I needed. And in the ashes, I found myself. Not as I was, but as I am now, whole, unfinished, alive. She looked around her small apartment. Paintings on the wall. Printed pages on the desk. A plant she hadn't yet killed. Her own breath. And whispered. This is enough. Margaret's life no longer felt borrowed. Not from her past. Not from her children. Not from the idea of what a woman should be at 50. She was finally building something of her own. The days weren't dramatic, but they were full. She would rise early, still used to waking before the sun. She'd brew her coffee, settle into the blue chair by the window, and begin each morning with a ritual, a quiet moment, a sketch, a sentence. Nothing profound. But it was hers. And there was something sacred about living gently on her own terms. The community center class grew. At first, it was just a few women painting. Then came the stories. Marlene, who used to be a school principal before cancer changed her body and her marriage. Tanya, a truck driver's widow who hadn't touched a paintbrush in 40 years. Rita, a mother of 5 who confessed, through tears, that she didn't remember the last time she made something just for herself. Margaret didn't just teach them how to hold a brush. She taught them how to hold space for themselves. Each session became part art, part therapy, part sisterhood. At the end of every class, they shared one sentence that captured how they felt. I remembered I exist. I stopped apologizing for needing color. I feel awake. They laughed. They cried. They healed, in quiet strokes and bright pigments. And Margaret, watching it unfold, realized, this too was part of her second half. Helping other women find theirs. Then came the invitation. An email. Unexpected. From the director of a regional women's empowerment conference. She had read the second half and asked if Margaret would consider speaking at their spring gathering. I'm not a speaker, Margaret typed into the draft reply. I'm just a writer. But before she hit send, she paused. Because wasn't that the point? She had spent her life saying, I'm just a wife. Just a waitress. Just a beginner. Not anymore. So she erased the draft and wrote instead. I'd be honored. The conference hall was packed. Rows of women, young, old, polished, unraveling, all waiting. Margaret's palms sweated as she stepped up to the podium. No slides. No big production. Just her voice. She looked at the audience and said, I used to think reinvention was something you had to earn. That it belonged to the bold, the young, the lucky. But I was wrong. Reinvention doesn't wait for permission. It waits for truth. And the truth is, your life isn't over until you decide it is. She told them about the gas station. The rain. The silence that nearly swallowed her whole. She told them about her daughter's anger. Her son's absence. The night she sat alone in a house that no longer felt like home. And then, she told them what came after. The blog. The brush. The book. Not because she was extraordinary. But because she chose to believe her story still mattered. Afterward, women lined up to speak to her. Some just held her hands. Some cried. One whispered, you said what I've been too scared to admit. It wasn't fame. It was resonance. And for Margaret, that was everything. Later that night, back in her quiet apartment, she opened her email and found a message from a woman named Clarice. I'm 57. Divorced after 30 years. My kids barely call. I thought I was invisible. Then I read your book. Thank you for reminding me I'm still here. Margaret wrote back. You are not invisible. You are unfolding. Her blog, Stories from the Second Half, now had over 10,000 subscribers. Not viral. Not flashy. But real. Women sent her art they'd created after reading her words. They started groups. They quoted her lines in journals and tattooed them on skin. And Margaret never stopped writing. Because writing wasn't just how she processed the world, it was how she claimed her place in it. She celebrated her 51st birthday with a potluck in the park. Eleanor brought her famous deviled eggs. Ruth, now frail but sharp as ever, read a poem aloud, for the woman who remembered her fire. Her daughter called, voice warm, and said, "Next year, we're doing it together." Her son sent flowers. With a note. For the woman who taught me how to stand back up. Margaret stood in the sunlight, surrounded by laughter and second chances, and thought. This is what rebuilding looks like. Not grand. Not perfect. But true. It happened on a Sunday evening, quiet, slow, one of those moments that slips in without warning. Margaret was tidying her apartment, humming softly to an old Carole King song, when she found it. A worn, folded piece of paper tucked under the pillow on the guest bed. Her daughter had stayed over a few nights ago, after a long heart-to-heart over Thai takeout and mugs of sleepy tea. Margaret recognized the handwriting instantly. Curious, she sat down, unfolded the paper, and read. Mom. I don't think I've ever told you this, but when Dad left, I blamed you. Not because you were wrong. But because it was easier than being mad at him. I saw you cry in the kitchen when you thought no one was looking. I saw the way your hands shook when you signed the papers. I saw how alone you looked in that big house when we came to collect our things. And I hated it. Not you. The pain. The confusion. The way everything fell apart. So I made you the villain. But the truth is, you were the only one holding things together. And now, watching you become who you are, I see it so clearly. You didn't just survive. You created something beautiful from the wreckage. You're the strongest person I know. And I'm proud to be your daughter. Love. Emily. Margaret held the letter in trembling hands. A part of her had waited years, decades, for those words. And yet, now that they were here, they didn't feel like an apology. They felt like a beginning. The weight of resentment, blame, and distance lifted, like fog burned away by morning sun. She closed her eyes and let herself feel it fully, not just the relief, but the deep, aching gratitude. The next day, she met Emily for brunch. No big speeches. No confrontations. Just the two of them, sipping coffee in a sunlit corner of a downtown cafe. I found your note, Margaret said, her voice soft. Emily looked nervous. I meant it. I know, Margaret said. Thank you. They didn't cry. Not there. Not then. But something shifted. A bridge rebuilt. Not perfectly. But enough to cross. Later that week, Margaret returned to her writing desk, inspired by the note. She began crafting a new piece, raw, intimate, different from anything she'd written before. It wasn't about grief. Or loss. It was about forgiveness. Not the kind you give others. The kind you give yourself. And then something surprising happened. A literary agent reached out. She had read Margaret's work and wanted to know if she'd consider expanding her blog stories into a full-length memoir. Margaret blinked at the message. Her first reaction? That old whisper of doubt, who do you think you are? But now, it didn't stick. She smiled and typed, confidently. Let's talk. The process was long, 6 months of late nights, edits, self-doubt, and sudden clarity. But the memoir came together. Title, The Letter Under the Pillow. A story not of tragedy, but of transformation. Of a woman who was abandoned in the rain, and learned to dance again under her own sky. When the book launched, it didn't just resonate with readers, it started conversations. Book clubs, libraries, women's shelters, even high school English teachers reached out. I gave this to my mom, one teenage girl wrote. We hadn't spoken in months. Now we're having coffee this weekend. Margaret was overwhelmed, not by attention, but by connection. Her story had become a mirror for others. A lifeline. Proof that the second half of life wasn't a slow fade, it could be a glorious awakening. And late one evening, after a long day of interviews and inboxes full of reader messages, she curled up in her blue chair and whispered. I made it. Not to fame. Not to fortune. But to herself. To the version of her that once sat at a gas station, soaking wet and broken, and chose to live anyway. The day of the book's signing was cloudy, with a hint of spring in the air. Margaret stood behind a modest table in the back of an independent bookstore, a stack of paperbacks beside her and a cup of tea growing cold near her elbow. She wasn't nervous. Not anymore. She had already lived through the hardest parts, the storm, the silence, the starting over. This was joy. The line wasn't long. But it was full of faces that mattered. A retired nurse who'd driven 3 hours from Connecticut. A young woman in college who whispered, "Your blog helped me leave someone I thought I needed." A man who said, "My mother passed last year. You wrote what I wish I could have told her." Each signature was more than a name, it was a quiet affirmation. That her pain had been transformed into purpose. That her voice had found its echo. After the event, as the crowd thinned, Margaret stepped outside and let the cool wind kiss her face. The world looked different now. Not perfect. Not safe. But possible. Later that evening, curled up on her couch, she opened her inbox. There was a message from a woman named Carla, age 52, recently divorced, struggling to pay rent and feeling invisible. It ended with, "Your words were like a light in the dark. I don't know how to start over. But now I know that I can." Margaret didn't hesitate. She replied, "You don't need to know how. Just that you're allowed. One breath. One choice. One step at a time. I'm rooting for you." She paused. Then added, "The second half of your story is yours to write." And that's what she wanted to say, to anyone listening. To the woman lying awake at 2 a.m., replaying every mistake. To the one walking through a grocery store aisle, pretending not to cry. To the mother, the daughter, the friend, the stranger. To you. You are not too late. You are not too broken. You are not too old, too soft, too much, too tired, too anything. You are right on time for the life that is still waiting for you. Will it be hard? Yes. Will people doubt you? Probably. Will you doubt yourself? Absolutely. But listen. There is a version of you that is already proud. She's up ahead, laughing again, creating again, loving again. And she's waiting for you. You don't have to run. You don't have to shout. You don't even have to believe all the way yet. Just begin. With a small act of rebellion. A morning walk. A story. A dream whispered into the dark. Start where you are. And keep going. Because you are the author now. Not the side character. Not the supporting role. You. And your second half? It's going to be magnificent.